Good morning. We're talking about the laws of davening, continuing where we left off in the Mishnah Berurah, Kuf Ches, Sifkat and Beis, which is 108.2 in the Mishnah Berurah. And we're talking about Tfilas Tashlumin. Tfilas Tashlumin is that if you miss one of the services, one of the Shemoneh Esreis, then you go back the next service and daven twice. So, for example, if you miss Shacharis, then you would daven two Minchas. If you miss Mincha, you would daven two Marivs. Now, there's a lot of details about these laws and certain guidelines. When can you daven a Tfilas Tashlumin? So we mentioned that you only daven a Tashlumin if you miss Shemoneh Esrei by accident or due to circumstances beyond your control. However, if for some reason you purposely didn't daven, then there's no Tashlumin. So this halacha is that you can make up a Shemoneh Esrei that you missed, but only if you missed it by accident or due to circumstances beyond your control. So we started talking about what are some different circumstances that are beyond your control. So let's pick up again in Sifkat and Beis. Oh nenas, kigon shayachole or shikar. You were sick or you were drunk. And being drunk, we're going to talk about more later on, more details if you were drunk. Because if a person is very drunk, he can't daven. Now we're going to learn there might be a difference if he had time to daven before he started drinking or not. We'll get to that, God willing, later. But if a person's sick, he's in bed, it's a classic example. It couldn't get up to daven Shemoneh Esrei, had a fever, whatever it was. Then, if he missed Shacharis, he'll daven Mincha twice. And we discussed also an onain. An onain is someone who loses one of his close relatives, and he's responsible for doing the funeral. So, since he is focused on doing the funeral in the honor of the deceased, he is exempt from performing all mitzvahs, so he doesn't daven. Now, what if after the aninus period is over, let's say the funeral is over in the early afternoon, and the person didn't have a chance to daven Shacharis because he was involved with the funeral? Does he daven two minchas? So onin she'avar lav zman tfilat shekavar mei. So ayin la'el b'siman ayin aleph. So follow Mishnah Berurah sham. Umi shebizman tefila lo haya lo. Okay. So over there we discussed that an onain, if he missed the entire time of davening, he does not do a Tfilas Tashlumin. He does not do an extra Shemoneh Esrei, because in this case, it wasn't like outside circumstances prevented him from davening, but rather the halacha said, do not daven now, you are patur, you are exempt from davening, so therefore do not daven. However, so that's when he was an onain the entire morning. There was absolutely no time that he could have possibly davened. So let's say the person died at night, and then the funeral was done in the afternoon. But let's say the person died in the morning. So really there was a time when he could have davened, and then the person died, and then in the early afternoon, they finished the funeral. So in such a case, then there would be a tashlumin, and he would daven mincha twice, since there was a small period of time where he technically could have davened. But in a case, then that's usually, I would think, a more rare situation. Usually it takes longer to prepare a funeral. So in the average case, where a person is preparing the funeral, then he would not daven a tashlumin. Okay. Let's say let's say a person, he didn't have water. There's a mitzvah, a person's supposed to wash his hands before he prays. So let's say there was no water to wash his hands, so because of that, he didn't daven. Does he daven two minchas, let's say? So gamzeh hu b'chalonis. Yeah, this is considered an onus, circumstances beyond his control. And he has to pray twice. But he says, however, lechatchila, a person should not skip davening just because he doesn't have water. One should wash his hands before he davens, but if he doesn't have water, he should still daven. But let's say a person here, like we're talking, he didn't know that halacha, and he didn't daven, he still should daven twice. That's a situation where he could daven twice. This is an interesting case. A person is involved in tzarchei tzibor, a person who's involved in certain communal matters. He's exempt from davening because he's busy with a mitzvah of being involved with the needs of the community. So let's say he was involved with the needs of the community all morning. Does he daven mincha twice? So ayin la'el b'sof siman tzaddigim Mishnah Berurah sham v'ayin prima gadim b'siman zeh shekasav denachon shegam zeh yispal achar kach lashim atfilah shechaser lo ach b'zeh yispal so b'tor sendava v'yichadish b'davar. So there it's discussed. There's actually a debate about this question. do we view when someone's osik b'tzarchei tzibur, involved with the communal needs, that's considered an outside circumstance which prevents him from davening, and therefore he would daven Shemoneh Esrei twice? Or do we say, no, the Torah says in this situation that don't daven. Since you're involved in another mitzvah, do not daven. You don't even have a requirement to daven here. And since there was never even a requirement to daven, you do not have to make it up later. You're similar. A person was similar to the onen, who has an exemption from davening. Or no, maybe we don't view it like that. Really, he has to daven. It was just as an outside circumstance preventing him from davening, and then he would do a tefillas tashlumin. So that is a debate. So the Mishnah Berurah concludes that really what someone should do is what we mentioned before regarding tefillas nedava. We mentioned that there's such a thing as a tefillas nedava, a voluntary Shemoneh Esrei. Now, a voluntary Shemoneh Esrei is usually not done because a person has to have intent, has to have kavanah the entire Shemoneh Esrei, which is something most of us are not able to do. However, we can use a tefillas nedava, a voluntary Shemoneh Esrei. In this kind of case, where we are mesupik, we're unsure if we're required to daven again. So if you remember from our last classes, what we said you should do if you're unsure if you're required to daven again, which is this case, right? This case is a case where someone was involved in communal matters, and there's a debate amongst the rabbis, do you have to daven again? Do you need a tefillas tashlumin? So this is what you do. You make a condition. You say, I'm going to, first, let's say, all morning, let's say, you were involved in communal matters. So now mincha comes, you daven mincha, now you're not sure, do I have to daven another Shemoneh Esrei for Shachris? So you say like this, if I am required to daven another Shemoneh Esrei, let this count as my tashlumin for Shachris. And you say, however, if I'm not required to daven another Shemoneh Esrei, then this should be a tefillas nedava. This should be a voluntary Shemoneh Esrei. In that case, one is allowed to do a nedava. And you should also, the Pri Megadim says, you should also be mechadish b'davar. You should add something new to the Shemoneh Esrei. And exactly why in this case you have to add something new, in other cases you don't, that could be discussed another time. And also, just one shouldn't assume that if he's involved in a communal matter not to daven, he should consult his rabbi, because not every case is the same. Okay, let's do one more sifkat in here. Let's do sifkat in Gimel. Lois Pal Shachar. So linyan kriyishma im yesh lo tashlumin ayin lael sof siman nun ches umeshek asav nisham Mishnah Berurah. About if one misses Shema, if he needs to repeat Shema, look in siman nun ches va'ayin sham o debirchas kriyishma ein lo tashlumin l'kol yama. Everybody holds by the blessings of Shema. You do not repeat them. So if you're davening mincha twice to make up for a shacharis that you missed, you'll do the shacharis, just the Shemoneh Esrei part, but you're not going to do the blessings before. So you do not do the blessings of Kriya Shema. Actually, let's do one more sifkatan. It's short. Mincha ukishehu shliach tzibor yotzi yedei hashlamim b'shemachzer tfilasu b'kol v'yichaven ba b'shvil atzmo letashlumin v'gam lahotzi ba mi she'eino baki. So what happens? Let's say you miss Shachris and they appoint you as the chazan to lead services for mincha. So in mincha, you daven silently and then you daven chazaras hashatz for the congregation. So does that chazaras hashatz count for your tashlumin of Shachris? So the answer is yes. You should have in mind, first you're davening the silent mincha, silent Shemoneh Esrei, and then when you do chazaras hashatz, you do the repetition of the Shemoneh Esrei. You should have in mind, one, that you are doing the Shemoneh Esrei aloud for the repetition to be motzi everybody, to fulfill everyone's obligation, doesn't know how to daven, and two, that it counts for tashlumin. So you kind of kill two birds with one stone when you say the tefillas tashlumin, when you say the chazaras hashatz for mincha. It counts for chazaras hashatz and it counts for tashlumin. Okay? Thank you to everyone who is listening, and have a beautiful, beautiful day.